Hello, Player One. Welcome to the Gaming History Club. My name is Gabby.
Hello, and I'm JP. Today we look at how Dungeons and Dragons, or as the cool kids call it, D&D, influenced video games more than possibly any other type of game ever. First, Player One, we must travel back to the ancient times of 200 years ago in Prussia.
Okay.
Yeah, nowadays also known as Germany. So in 1780, a teacher by the name of Johann Christian Ludwig Hellwig,
Okay. Wait.
say that 10 times fast.
I think you must have been still looking forward to do this part because you wanted to do all of the German name.
Yeah, no, I've been looking really excited now, haven't I, to finally get to say a German name in this podcast.
Sure, go on.
Johann Christian Ludwig Hellwig.
Okay.
So he was a teacher and he invented what is commonly accepted to be the true first war game, which was called Kriegsspiel, which literally means war game
Yeah.
in German, right? And the reason why it's commonly accepted to be the first true war game is because Johann actually tried to make this a realistic military simulation, all right? So it was heavily influenced by chess. And the reason for that being is that he was actually teaching a whole bunch of students who were going to very likely join military service, right? But he also did want to release this game as like a recreational thing as well and to sell it, right? And so by having it resemble chess in some way was going to have it be picked up more easily by the population.
Weren't they actually using chess figurines and actually using a chess board?
Yeah,
to
that's
play it,
right.
yeah?
Absolutely, yeah. So chess figurines, chessboard, but it was a very, very sophisticated chess game in a way, with military simulation elements to it. So that was the very start of war games, but war games would obviously continue to evolve, and then much of that chess influence would slowly start to diminish, and then you wouldn't have any more chess figurines after a while, so they would be replaced by actual military models, right? And also the square grid layouts that would be replaced by like actual surveyed maps.
Oh, nice.
Yeah.
Okay.
And there was a variant of Kriegsspiel that was made by Johann Ferdinand Opitz. And he actually introduced the roll of a dice. And he did that to simulate the unpredictable nature of the real world and war. Yeah. Um, in 1824, Army officer Georg Heinrich Rudolf Johann von Reiswitz invented a war game so realistic that the Prussian army actually adopted it as part of the military training. And already here we can see many elements of what would become Dungeons and Dragons later. So the umpire, for example, which is the referee person, which is very similar to the role of a dungeon master that would later be in D&D. You had things like hit point tracking as well, and kind of like statuses, I want to call them. So, like, you had things like the army's morale and exhaustion levels. So, there's like so much to it, and it's super in depth. And I'd love to like talk way more about it, but we have to kind of continue our grossly oversimplified timeline of how D&D came to be. So, yeah, let's move on for now. So, following Prussia's victory in the Franco-Prussian War of 1870, Prussia's war games gained notoriety and attention now. So, a lot of like their successes were thought of to be perhaps, related to their military training style with using games to simulate some of their tactics and strategies, right? Yeah, so the war game phenomenon now became more worldwide. So, fast forwarding a little bit to 1913, the legendary writer H.G. Wells, of all people, who you might know from The Time Machine and The War of the Worlds, legendary science fiction writer H.G. Wells, he, of all people, created a rule set for playing with toy soldiers, and he gave rise to playing with miniature war games. And so the popularity of these miniature war games, though, would also very slowly rise in popularity as a recreational pastime, but not particularly fast, just because, well, we did have two major global world wars happening. So I guess you wouldn't want to glorify war with miniature war games, right, during this
Yeah.
time. And also, there was high demand for all kinds of resources, right, during war times. So there wouldn't be a lot of resources left over to make games with, right? Um, so fast forwarding a little bit, in 1956, British wargamer Tony Buff published the first rule set for war games set in the medieval period. So that was a first, because most of the time we had battles set during the Napoleonic War or the American Civil War, for example. But no, Tony Buff, he, for the first time, had one that simulates medieval battles.
So yeah, I guess around that time, a lot of the war games literally tried to portray real military setting rather than medieval setting.
Yeah, that's right. So it was, although it was a recreational pastime, it was very much like a war game, like a simulation, right? So I guess they didn't have any need to simulate battles with sword and axes anymore by 1956. They
Yeah,
upgraded to guns and stuff.
makes
Yeah.
sense.
So in 1971, fellow JP, Jeff Perrin, would also develop a miniature wargame system in a medieval setting called Chain Mail. Gary Gygax would contribute to the game by including a fantasy supplement in what was to become the first fantasy miniature wargame inspired by novels such as, amongst others, J.R.R. Tolkien's Lord of the Rings, but like I said, also many other fantasy themed novels and media, which added fantasy concepts now as well, like magic spells. So now we've got medieval and also fantasy stuff happening.
Yeah, and that's definitely what's familiar nowadays
Yeah,
for us gamers now, in a
yeah.
way. Yeah. But yeah, separately to that though, Dave Arneson was also working on a medieval war game with fantasy elements called Blackmaw. That one is more focusing on role playing individuals rather than the entire armies and conceptualizing many D&D elements like the character classes, experience points, leveling up, and of course, adventuring in dungeons or dungeon crawling. Gary Gygax and Dave Arneson actually know each other and they would finally create Dungeons and Dragons, releasing it to the world in 1974. That actually coincided with the rise of video games in general, so what a good timing, to be honest.
Yeah, if we think about the time, 1974, there was very, very little happening in video games. I believe Pong, released by Atari, that was like 71.
Yeah, barely any arcade games too, right? So that's still really
Yeah,
early
yeah,
in a
not
way.
much was happening in terms of video games just yet.
Yeah, and just 1 year after Dungeons and Dragons was released, Gygax, together with Rob Kunz, actually published an expansion of the rules for D&D that was called Supplement 1 Greyhawk. That one actually expands the character classes and spells, and that was directly inspired by the Greyhawk campaign created by Gygax himself. By the way, this topic is super interesting about Greyhawk and the history of Dungeons and Dragons itself. And if you're interested in this topic, Player One, please do let us know because who knows? We'll make an episode of that in the future. Anyway, let's get to video games itself because actually the first Dungeons and Dragon inspired video games didn't take long at all to be created after the game itself was released, the tabletop version, which is really remarkable. D&D was a huge success and it was really popular. In their first year of release, it sold around 1,000 copies, which doesn't sound like super much, but these are quite an impressive number if you think about it.
Yeah, I guess you would also have to think about like if 1,000 copies get sold, that's like, three, four, five plus people actually using it as well. Yeah.
That's true
Mm, mm.
because like if you buy one, you can use it with your friends and with your party, basically. So
Yeah,
there
exactly.
you go.
Yeah.
And just 1 year after, in 1975, it was sold around 3,000 copies. So that's tripled already. But if we fast forward to 1981, so that's 7 years after its release, the game had more than 3 million players worldwide.
That really exploded, didn't it? Yeah.
Definitely
Like
did.
really exploded, yeah.
Yeah. So, yeah, definitely something really impressive when it was released. And longtime listeners will be familiar with the Plato mainframe computer system that was available at some American universities and laboratories in the 70s. You know, the Plato that we talk about a lot, basically.
Yes, the computer mainframe system, not the philosopher, of course.
No, definitely not. Although that one is also JP's favorite, but
Yes,
not that one.
food for a different podcast episode.
Yeah, but if you don't actually remember about Plato itself, don't worry, we will definitely cover this fascinating piece of video game history in more detail in one of our future episodes.
Yeah, I think we definitely need to. There's just so much that we keep falling back to when it comes to Play-Doh. I think this is
Ah,
the
I know.
second or third episode that like crops up, basically.
I know it might be more though, to be fair, but I can't really count right now, so.
No, like 2D to 3D, a new dimension. Yeah, first person shooter came up. Yeah, but it just keeps coming back up, Plato. So it probably just needs its own episode one day
Definitely.
in 2025, maybe. Wink, wink, epic foreshadowing.
And there's quite a lot to talk about anyway, about the system itself, so definitely food for thought for another episode. So, students were creating and playing video games on these mainframe computers, never really intended to be released to the public, and it was just a way for them to have some fun,
Yes.
basically. The teachers and university staff were obviously not really happy with this though, since the games can take quite a lot of space that were meant to be like educational space in the mainframe, not for games. So, yeah, they kind of often deleted the games, but gamers always found a way. So, the young game developers always just going back, sneaking in into the mainframe, hiding those schemes in some hidden areas of the memory, hoping that it won't be found and it won't be deleted, basically.
Yeah, I'll have an example of this very shortly as well. Mm.
Yeah, that's true. Some of the game names were created out of necessity to make them sound like an actual legit thing, like an educational program. But, they were in fact just games, obviously. So they try to be very smart with how they hide this within the mainframe. Just imagine yourself being a young computer enthusiast that enjoy coding and programming to then hear about this brand new type of tabletop games that works with rolling dice, calculating points. It just seems like a no-brainer to try to change that into like a video games basically.
You've been given bread and you've been given butter. So what do you make?
Toasty.
Yes, a butter bread.
Okay, butter bread.
Okay.
Sure.
So at the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign campus, several D&D inspired games have been made as early as 1974 and 1975, the very same year that D&D gets released to the public. The first one we'll be talking about is Petit 5, and it's perhaps not the very first computer RPG and dungeon crawler ever made, but it certainly is the earliest surviving game that we can fall back to. And it was made by Reginald Rusty Rutherford. So the game's real name is actually The Dungeon, but it's more commonly referred to as Petit 5 because that was the file name of the game. And the reason it was the file name is because Rusty was part of the population and energy group at his university, right? And that group was assigned 5 memory slots, which were called Petit 1 through to 5.
Within the Plato system,
Yes, on the
basically.
Plato mainframe computer system. That's
Okay.
right. And so Petit 1 to 3, they all had like educational programs on it already. But Petit 4 and 5, they actually were basically surplus, so they could be used by the group to do whatever they liked with it. Obviously, for educational purposes, quote unquote,
Mhm.
ideally, but whatever. So he named the game file name Petted 5 so that someone just like looking over the file, like a system admin just looking over the file names, he wouldn't find that weird that there's a Petted 5 in there. It's just one of the memory slots. But secretly, actually, yes, that was a game, The Dungeon. So let's talk a little bit about Petted 5, also known as The Dungeon. It was a true digital recreation of the Dungeons and Dragons tabletop experience, but it was made for a single computer player. So the character stats are generated randomly, just as a true roll of the dice, actually, with the classical attributes strength, intelligence, constitution, dexterity, and hits, health, basically. And interestingly though, the player character is a mixture of all of the original D&D's classes. So you are playing as a mixture of a fighter, magic user, and cleric. And this was well because you are a single player, so you can't fill your party with other players, unfortunately. Yeah, and since I'm talking about this being a single player game, I should also very quickly mention so Rusty was actually aware of some of his students at the campus who wanted to make a D&D game as well, but make it a multiplayer experience. But he obviously, he's like, you know what, I can't wait. I'm just going to make my own game and I'll just make it single player for the time being. So he just went ahead and made this game in like 4 to 6 weeks, right? Really cool. Also, death is permanent in this game, so if you lost, yeah, you're gonna have to start all the way from the beginning. But this wasn't some kind of like technological, constriction. No, like if you wanted to save between play sessions, you could just save and come back. But if you die, no, that's a permanent death. You're gonna have to start again all the way from the beginning. Anyhow, so there are random enemy encounters, of course, just like in D&D, and the combat options that you can decide on include fight, flee, or use magic spells. There's also a selection of spells available, such as sleep, cure wounds, and magic missiles, the classic D&D spells, basically. And although soon D&D inspired games would often have random generating maps, in the dungeon the map itself was fixed and the enemy encounters and treasure though that was random that you can find. The objective, just like it says in the intro, by the way, is to gain 20,000 experience points, and these are gathered mainly together with collecting gems and jewelry.
Speaking of that intro of Pettit 5, because you showed me how it looks like, right? The intro page. I was really interested with what they say in the intro. As a well educated young person, you know how to use a sword and have a certain acquaintance with magical and clerical spells. I'm like, okay, cool,
Yeah.
sure.
I always imagine the kids from Stranger Things reading out the intro to me when I read it out myself. Yeah. The game was originally played in the classic Play Doh terminal's friendly orange glow, as they used to call it. So, in that very orange color, black on orange. So, it looks very much like the Fallout New Vegas orange Pip Boy. That makes
Ah,
sense.
yeah, that's a
Mm.
nice color to be fair.
Yeah, it's a very nice orange. Yeah.
Yeah, it's actually really cool, isn't it? That only a year after the tabletop Dungeons and Dragons, we already see quite a few games being made for it. Of course, video games and D&D were seemingly just, perfect match for each other really, starting from the roll of the dice to calculate what happens during combat. Rather than you rolling the dice, the computer will do it instead with some, I mean, granted, it's quite primitive looking visual, but, it's as early as 1975, so that's truly remarkable.
Yeah, absolutely incredible. It's also very different from like the more action-oriented games that you've gotten until this point, which is a lot of like, you know, Tennis for Two, Space War.
Yeah.
They're all kind of like action-oriented, whereas like technically in the dungeon, like you can take your time. think about your next move,
Yeah.
right? It's not instant feedback, so to say.
To put this in perspective, just like JP mentioned before, actually, there isn't even a real home console market yet around this time. There was only the Magnavox Odyssey and Home Pong consoles. So, yeah, the arcades too were still very much in their infancy. Simple shoot and racing games slowly, replacing the Pong hype around this time. So, yes, you could definitely say this was the most exciting and creative thing happening in video games between the 74-75 time.
Yeah, without a doubt.
And Pettit 5 is far from the only game that was directly inspired by Dungeons and Dragons' popularity. Many others were being made all around the same time. I guess the mathematical nature of both tabletop gameplay and a computer, it's just way too obvious for you to miss the opportunity to do something with it.
Yes, young, enthusiastic students were rubbing their hands together all over the world in anticipation for what was about to happen.
That's true. As a well educated young person, yeah.
Yes, who know how to use a sword.
Cool.
So, Player One, remember how I said that Rusty also knew of some students making a D&D game? Well, they also made a D&D game, and they also released it around the same time in 1975, and they called it the Game of Dungeons. And similarly to Pettit 5, though, it is more commonly referred to by its file name D&D, smaller case letters, Delta November Delta,
Yeah.
D&D.
I think you should call it Delta November Delta from now on, just so that it's not confusing.
Yeah,
Which D&D?
also sounds like a war game, doesn't it?
Huh, that's true, yeah.
Nice. It all comes full circle. So, unfortunately, though, they didn't implement the multiplayer as they did want to. And the game does resemble Pettit 5 actually in a number of ways as well when you just like casually play it. But I mean, there wasn't much in terms of graphics anyway, so of course it's going to look kind of similar, really. Um, the game was made by Gary Wisenhunt and Ray Wood, but they collaborated and shared ideas with Rusty back and forth very clearly as well. The most obvious similarity is that you control a single character again, and he has a mixture of all class abilities, so fighter, magic user, and cleric.
So it's the same, basically.
Yes, absolutely, yeah. But here's one super exciting main key difference. D&D was the very first game ever to have a boss enemy in a video game, as far as we know.
You're talking about Delta November Delta, right?
Yes, or the game of dungeons. It
Okay,
gets very difficult with the Play-Doh stuff because it's also mysterious.
that's true.
But
Yeah.
yeah, this game is the very first where we find a boss character.
Nice.
Yeah, right. And if you wonder what was the first ever boss character, well, it was a huge dragon, and you need to get the orb from this dragon and then flee with it, which is video game as heck, isn't it?
Classic.
Yeah.
Yeah. Love that.
So death means death too in this game again. If you lose, you're back to square one and back at the character creation menu. But unlike Pettit 5 though, and I really like this, when you roll for the stats for your attributes, you can actually just click re-roll. So you can just like keep going until you are happy with what you've gotten, basically, rather than having to restart the entire game. And in the game, you must enter the dungeon with multiple levels to fight through enemies, get gold, and get your experience points. Very classic RPG stuff, really. And just like in the original D&D tabletop game, getting the gold directly affects your attributes too, and in very significant ways. So, for example, for every 4,000 gold that you gain, you also get an additional hit point. And how much gold you can hold also decides how high the levels of the enemies are that you encounter.
So basically, it provides a little bit of that dynamic levels, basically.
Yeah. So the more gold you have, the harder the enemies will also be that you encounter.
Interesting.
Yeah, and your spells, they can only be used once, and the enemies actually have weaknesses to certain spells as well. So obviously, it's a very intricately crafted game as well, like some serious deep thought has gone into making this game, which again, it's just remarkable because like there is nothing else like this out yet, for the public. It's just happening in this lab for these lucky students who have a very early computer in their hands.
So yeah, let's quickly talk about one more game made on the Plato system, Moria, also developed in 1975 or 1976. To be honest, we're not really sure.
Yes, but only because the developers aren't so sure anymore themselves either. So
Like, was it
yeah,
75? Was
like
it
who knows?
76? Who
We
knows?
were at
Yeah.
uni. We were just students living our lives. Who cares?
Fair enough, yeah. So, who are those developers? This game was made by Kevin Duncombe and Jim Batten. It started out as a 2D top down game inspired by and similar to Delta November Delta, D&D, before. And Jim Batten finally suggested to make the game 3D instead, like other games on the Plato computer system like Spasm,
Spacer.
Spacem,
It's supposed to be like space
Yeah,
simulator.
I know.
Spacem, not spasm.
Oh god, I always say Spasm.
But you know what? I heard that like everyone also made the same joke back in the day, so they also call it spasm.
Okay,
Yeah.
so that's fine.
Yeah,
Then
yeah,
I'm
yeah. It's
saying no,
cool.
no,
Yeah,
I'm
yeah, yeah.
sorry. I don't mean to offend anyone,
We're
but yeah.
insiders. It's all good.
But yeah, in Moria, up to 10 players can play together. How impressive is that? And even better yet, players sometimes choose to do it in true D&D style, like they actually role play their in-game characters.
That is so cool, and it's so far ahead of its time in so many different ways.
I know, how impressive is that, right? We've been playing 3D RPGs with each other, with your friends, as far back as like 1975, possibly.
This is way before cosplaying as well, let me tell you. You know what I mean?
Oh my god, that's just crazy. But anyway, let's now have a look at some of other games that D&D influenced, but outside Plato, because we've been talking about Plato-focused games so far.
So, Dungeons and Dragons was also cited as an inspiration by Will Crowther, who in 1976 released the first ever text adventure game called Colossal Cave Adventure.
Ooh, yeah, I remember that game.
Yes, and I remember the episode very well too. I believe it was episode number 3. What a fun episode that was too.
Yeah, it's the point and click adventure episode, I
Yeah, that's
believe,
right.
right? Yeah, that's quite a while ago. But
That's very long
anyway,
ago.
gone, gone.
So most of his game was based on his experiences that he made whilst exploring and surveying the Mammoth Cave in Kentucky, which is the longest cave system in the world. But Dungeons and Dragons, he has cited as being one of his major contributing influences as well. And I can totally see where he's coming from, although I don't want to put words in his mouth. But in the game, the player basically reads the context of what is happening around him and the description of his surroundings, right? And you can type commands in, like get lamp, for example. So, in effect, if you think about it, the computer actually takes on the role of dungeon master, right? Guiding the player through the game.
So yeah, if Colossal Cave Adventure is a fully text-based game, in 1980, Atari actually wanted to make a version of Colossal Cave Adventure, but with graphic. Developed by Warren Robinett, came the game simply called Adventure. Not really creative, isn't it?
No, very blunt, very
I
straightforward
know.
name here. Just, yeah, it's an adventure.
Well, but at least we know that's an adventure game.
Yeah.
Yeah, anyway, the game would leave its mark in history as one of the earliest action adventure games, as well as defying Atari's golden rule, where they don't really want to name who developed the game within their credit titles. So, being cheeky, in one of the earliest Easter eggs in video games, the player can actually find a secret room where it says created by Warren Robinett. Yeah, he made a name of himself.
Awesome.
Yeah,
Awesome.
that's awesome.
Yeah, also in 1980, inspired by both Colossal Cave Adventure as well as Dungeons and Dragons, Michael Toy and Glyn Wickman released a game called Rogue. And Rogue was a dungeon crawler for home computer systems, and similar in essence to the games that were made for the Plato computer system, It added procedural generation to levels though, so every time you played a game, the levels would look completely different, and it kept the game very fresh. And it also included the permadeath, of course. So, although it wasn't the first rogue-like game, Rogue would lend its name to an entirely new subgenre as well, now in the making, with roguelike games. All in all, it seems that Dungeons and Dragons has had a really deep, intricate influence on video games, and in so many different ways too, and at so many different points from which it entered into video games from. It's actually very impossible to imagine video games without Dungeons and Dragons, I would say.
Yeah, and we've explored the history of how Dungeons and Dragons creeps into the world of video games. But how does that reflect in nowadays video games? Like, where do we see this influence nowadays, not only in the games back then? Well, the first one that we want to touch on is actually character designs. So, if you play nowadays RPG games, you'll be made to spend the quote unquote points you have in the different attributes like strength, dexterity, health, and what have yous. Back then, with Dungeons and Dragons, you do have to roll the dice, and sometimes what you roll is kind of what you get, although that keeps changing throughout time. This is where it gets interesting. This is how Dungeons and Dragons influence video games with influencing the gameplay, but also how video games influence Dungeons and Dragons. For example, back then, if I'm rolling the dice for my character, what I roll is simply will be what I get. There are so many rules now where it wants you to take the best out of three rolls, for example, or take the average of the best of three, or something like that. So it's always really complicated. But yeah, I guess it comes with nowadays modern games where it tries to be a little bit more fair to all of the players.
I guess there's two ways you could look at this. I mean, in one way, it's nice where you have like the control over what attributes to give to
Hmm.
your character, so you can really like have the character you always wanted to be. But on the other hand, it keeps things very lively and fresh and new, because if you just have to deal with a character that you've rolled, then you might choose a class and race that best suits that character as well, right? So you have to deal with what you're given. So I guess that's also kind of cool, though, isn't it?
Well, yeah, exactly, which I think is actually the beauty of the original Dungeons and Dragons, in my honest opinion, which links into my second point really nicely, which is the open worldness of Dungeons and Dragons back then, which influenced games nowadays. So, Dungeons and Dragons obviously push player to be imaginative and exploring this open world that the dungeon master is creating, which is why if you have certain character with certain attribute points, you play according to the stats that you have and the abilities that you have, weapons that you can use, which is like very interesting, and it's always different if you want to play a different campaign, right? But anyway, the possibilities are always endless with the original Dungeons and Dragons. Open world video games nowadays embrace that point where you can find side quests that's hidden in some random NPCs in the middle of nowhere, and you can explore hidden dungeons and stuff like that. I'm thinking about Elden Ring right now somehow, but anyway.
I was thinking of Fallout 4.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Oh, exploring faults, basically, right?
Yes.
But yeah, the point is like you embrace that open world and everything you can find in that world.
Yeah, and of course we also have the fantasy characters, the high fantasy, typical of the genre characters. So Dungeons and Dragons kept the fantasy races or species alive. So, from the J.R.R. Tolkien's books like The Hobbit from 1936 or Lord of the Rings from the 50s, it kept that whole high fantasy genre basically alive.
Yeah, it really brought it into video games world from only the books world somehow.
Yeah, I mean, I guess it wasn't in the mainstream, perhaps, but it kept it alive in people's imagination, I would say, definitely. Critical hits is another thing that we have from the Dungeons and Dragons experience, right? And that seems to be in like almost every single game now. For no reason at all, mostly out of pure luck or chance, you get those sweet extra damage points just for getting lucky, it seems like.
Yeah, because it's like in Dungeons and Dragons itself, right? When you roll a natural 20, they call it, which is like you landed the highest point, it grants you that critical hit and grant you an automatic success of what it is that you're rolling for, which is really cool that we see that a lot in nowadays video games.
Yeah, and that's everywhere. First person shooters, role playing games, it's in almost every single type of game now. And adventure parties, of course, playing co op with other people and having the adventure together. Role playing throughout the adventure, understanding the strengths and weaknesses as a group to make the adventure truly your own, that definitely comes to us from Dungeons and Dragons. Oh, and least we forget, of course, bosses.
Yeah, enemy bosses.
Yeah.
Woohoo! Yeah.
We hope you enjoyed this episode, Player One, and learned something new about old video and tabletop games.
Yeah, and what about you though, Player One? Any legendary tabletop games you'd like us to explore? Are you a big fan of Dungeons and Dragons world itself? Well, let us know. We'd love to hear from you. Drop us a message on our website, gaminghistory.club. New episodes of Gaming History Club are released every other Wednesday, so make sure you subscribe and follow us on our social media. We're on Instagram and Facebook as Gaming History Club.
The holiday season is nearly here, Player One, so come back in a couple of weeks where we will walk down memory lane, remembering the most iconic drops during the festive season in video games history. See ya!